Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. We've missed you. There will be homework after this and a test tomorrow. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Mike Gibbs. I'm a professor of economics and also faculty director of the executive MBA program. Welcome back, all my old students. Good to see you. And thank you, the rest of you, for coming. And I hope you're enjoying our reunion. So MBA programs are, of course, about careers. And career switching is a big motivation for lots and lots of MBAs. But I think that has changed over time. As someone who's been teaching in MBA programs for like 25 years, used to be lots and lots of attachment to an employer, lots and lots of interest in working for the giant corporations, the General Electrics and so forth, the auto companies. And I don't think that's true anymore. I remember about 6 years ago, I did an informal study of my students who graduated from XP. It's probably XP 76. We have a couple of XP 75s in the room. Yeah, and one XP 76, I think, somewhere. And how many had changed jobs in the first year since they graduated? And my informal estimate, but it was pretty systematic, was about 80%. And most of those were actually changing employers, too, not just a promotion. It's enormous. And then Bill Kuzer, who ran the program back then, did some statistical analysis and came up with a similar number. I'd be interested at some point whether Anita in the back there has seen similar numbers. So career changing is enormous in the couple of years after graduation. I think that maybe even more so in the executive MBA program in some sense, including changes in industries and functions, not just employers. And then there's some other trends. One trend I see, I think, is a tendency towards downsizing. Big companies aren't attractive anymore. Who wants to work for those big, bloated, bureaucratic corporations? There seems to be a lot more interest in working for smaller companies. And that's not just the kids graduating from the full-time program. That's the semi-adults graduating from the executive MBA program as well. Semi-adults, yes. I'm not quite sure why that is. Maybe you guys could illuminate that a little bit. I think some of that is just long-term, there seems to be less interest and comfort in these large organizations. Businesses change more rapidly. There's been a lot more restructuring since about 1980, for about 30 years or more globally. There's a huge interest in entrepreneurship now, new ventures. There's a lot of excitement in these little startup companies, and a lot of people want to get involved in that. And then right now, of course, we have an extraordinarily challenging economy and labor market, and that forces some changes even if they weren't desired. Whether they're desirable or not ex post would be an interesting thing to find out. But a lot of people going into lines of work and types of companies they never ever expected. And that's kind of the theme of this session. So without any further ado, I'm just going to take a second to introduce our three panelists. I'm very pleased to have you guys here, and I'm going to try as much as I can to turn things over to you guys. I would love to see you guys mix the discussion a lot more than those geeks just did, those macroeconomists. The only thing more boring than macroeconomists is probably accounting professors. But, so without further ado, our panelists today are all alumni from our executive MBA program. Down at the end, Russ Maki is XP 64, graduated in the 190 building, which was the building we had over near Water Tower before we built Gleacher Center. And some of us remember that. I taught there, but not when you were a student. Russ is now president of Grass Conservation Company since 2009. GCC is one of the nation's largest private conservation labs. They restore, conserve, and preserve works on paper and vellum, including fine art, archival documents, high-end collectibles, important family papers, and so forth. One of the most notable projects recently was Russ's company performed a series of treatments on the House resolution for a 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which was signed February 1st, 1865, to abolish slavery. So that must have been exciting. Prior to acquiring GCC, Russ was president of Epicurean Art Foods, a Chicago-based specialty food manufacturer. That sounds like a fun job, too. Sitting next to Russ is Ram Krishnan, XP81, our most recent vintage. Welcome back, with some classmates in the room. Ram is Senior Vice President of Active Network since last year. And from what I've been told, it's been an active year. Active Network is a technology company that provides software for organizers of activities, events, and other kinds of experiences. Ram leads 6 units throughout North America for AN. Before that, he worked at GE Healthcare in that division for 15 years. So that would have been a classic old career. So you're a very clear example of these changes. And most recently was leading a global business unit in healthcare IT for GE. And then sitting right here to my right is Jim Bresingham from XP70, which did have classes in Gleacher Center. Jim is CFO of Pampered Chef, which, by the way, is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, and he's been there since 2009. Jim is responsible for all financial areas within Pampered Chef, as well as strategy international support groups. Prior to Pampered Chef, Jim was SVP and CFO at Serva, which was a $4 billion global relocation and moving services company. Before that, he was Director of Business Development for Sears Roebuck & Company, speaking of yet another large traditional company. Okay, so I guess the plan is I would like each of these gentlemen to give us a brief synopsis of their story so we have some idea of who we have in the room. First, and we'll just start, I guess we'll just move this way. There's no real logic to the order.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
I guess I'll say after that, I'll probably have a question or two. I want these guys to talk to each other as much as possible, and then we will have some time to open the floor up at the end.
All right. It's interesting, the title of today's session, Leaving the Safety of a Large Corporation. I'm probably the definition of that. Prior to Epicurean Art Foods that Mike mentioned, I was with a wholesale printing paper distributor for almost 20 years of my career.
Dunder Mifflin?
It was not, and I hear they had a nice run. We focused on niche marketing of specialty printing papers to the commercial printing trade. And as my career was going up and as I was moving up in the ranks and ultimately becoming president of that company, simultaneously the market for printing papers was cratering. So I went from a situation where I was playing offense every day, enjoying every opportunity that came my way, to managing an organization that was playing defense every day. And that was a very difficult transition for me to make. Long story short, left there, ended up going to the food business. Again, networking has everything to do with that. My former CFO actually had left the company prior to myself, saw the writing on the wall before I did, and he ended up landing at a food company, wanted to know if I wanted to have national sales and marketing for them. Fungible skills, as Mike's talking about, you can take what you learn here at lots of places. Thought it would be an interesting challenge. From there, myself and the executive team ended up buying a completely different food company called Epicurean Art Foods. So it was my first opportunity to get some skin in the game and actually try running a company myself, which we were very successful at. Literally increased top line 8-fold in about 3 years' time. But unfortunately, it was in the frozen food appetizer space. And as quickly as we ramped it up, once the recession of 07-08 hit, the popular thing to do from a PR perspective was to cancel your holiday parties. Well, you can imagine what that does to an appetizer business where 60% of your revenues occur from Labor Day through December 1st. So one day I had to walk in and literally terminate 100 employees. And at the end of that day, that was one of those watershed moments for me. I said, I'm not going to do that again. I'm just tired. So I took a little bit of a self-analysis of what it was I was looking to do and put together a want list. And my want list included a lot of things. One was I didn't want to work for a company where share was my entire objective. I wanted to be involved in growing markets and opportunities and things along those lines. I certainly didn't want to have a lot of financial partners if that was at all possible. If I could self-fund a deal, that's what I wanted to do. You know, if the company has a bad day, I wanted to yell at myself as opposed to have to answer to a lot of other folks. I also really, I think, was interested in getting back into the paper world, graphics, something along those lines. At the time, I had no idea what that was. And then lastly, based on my food experience, this is the key criteria for me. I never wanted to visit Bentonville, Arkansas ever again. Sounds like some of you have shared that experience. Anyway, long story short, through, again, networking, a friend of mine knew I was looking for something, and a struggling paper conservation company here in Chicago was looking for a buyer. It was just an absolutely perfect opportunity. The company was being run by conservators. It was world-class museum clients, high net worth collector clients, private individuals, and they needed a general manager to come in and basically take the reins and run the organization. And in turn, that freed them up to do what they're literally world-class at doing to begin with. So it was kind of win-win from that perspective. So going on our 4th year together, it's been a remarkable success story, and I can tell you that going to work every day, wanting to do what you do is a huge change. I love what we do. And as Mike says, you know, we've had a number of remarkable opportunities, things to work on, most notably the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It's a big deal.
Thanks, Russ. Well,
What do you next? All right. So my name's Krishnan. I worked at GE for 15 years, and to talk a little bit about my career transition or my change. You know, I kind of sat at that point, 15 years into a career with the company. Like Mike said, not a lot of people do that. Probably all my friends and you know, kind of peers that I went through undergraduate school with, that I came out with, all of them had probably changed jobs 10 times by the time they had hit 15 years or so. And I had a great run at GE. I had 15 years of just amazing career growth, great management training, leadership training, global experience, and I was just getting lots of great promotions and big jobs, going from managing teams of 10 to 20 to 500 to 1,000. And everything seemed like, on the surface, it was a great kind of deal. And I had a summer where I was one of 2 or 3 people shortlisted to kind of take the next big kind of jump in the company to run like a $2 billion business with 5,000 employees, just a huge, huge job. And I went through the interview process, and you know, I didn't get the job. They gave it to a guy that ended up being an officer of the company. And it was like the best moment I think I could have had. I was just so happy I didn't get that job, because I realized when I was going through that process that there's a point at which everything is kind of the same, and you just get more of it. It gets bigger, the pressure is greater, the scale is larger, but the job was a lot the same. You could be a president at a company like GE, but you're really not president. You know, when you're a general manager of a business unit at like large companies like that, you're basically living in the income statement. You don't, maybe a little bit of a cash metric here or there, but you're really not, you know, you're really not running your own show. And it's kind of cliche, but a lot of us, we're always talking about, I think, when you're talking to your buddies from B school or whatever, you're always talking about wanting to run your own business someday. Everyone talks about it. It's kind of at the heart of why most people try to advance their careers in business school. And I just came to the realization that wasn't going to happen at a large corporation. There's only one CEO in one kind of corporate environment, and that's, 16 layers removed from where I was. And so that kind of got me to start answering the phone, because we all get phone calls, and that got me starting to actually listen and take a few of the calls seriously and think about the criteria, like you did, Russ, of what I wanted or what I needed or would look for. And ultimately, what I wanted is to go somewhere where I got the chance to do the things I wouldn't for a long time at a company like a large corporation, which is getting board experience, getting investor and analyst experience, kind of involved in some way, shape, or form with the capital structure of the business, just the types of things at the kind of top that are somewhat separate from a day-to-day operating job in a large corporation. And I knew I didn't want to go to a startup. I knew I wanted to go somewhere that was just about ready to scale, but didn't really know how to scale, that had already kind of got past the proof stage and got past the can get deals in the market, but just doesn't know how to put it together for growth. And that's how I ended up bumping into the company. I ended up joining a technology firm that had just gone IPO, had gone from 0 to 400 million, really like 50 to 400 million within a 2 to 3 year period, and really was not sure how to scale the business. And it was just a good fit. And I've gotten a lot of that experience that I wanted. Now the ride's been really chaotic, and I could tell you the story over the years, and maybe we'll get through some of it today. But it's been a really chaotic experience, which is something you're also sheltered from, I think, in a large corporation. But it's been good on that side of the front, and then I've gotten the board experience, the investor experience. I'm presenting to 22-year the analysts that like measure, like, analyze our company, these like 22-year-old kids that are like right out of college, who are sitting there like asking us about like all these apps that they're using, but these are the guys and gals that end up, writing the reports about your company, and those are things I never would have seen at GE for years and years and years, and I so far I've loved the experience. I've had a chance to shape and drive our culture. Those are all the things I wanted to be able to do, and that's what has been rewarding and exciting about the change.
Okay, thanks. Jim?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I actually, before I joined Sears, I was in a major consulting firm working on mergers and acquisitions. And we worked on deals primarily on the buy side. In a given year, we would work on, 20, 30 acquisitions, and they would range from your company from a revenue size on the small size, 50 to 100 million, on the big size, a $50 billion deal. So you kind of saw a broad spectrum of what the companies were about. I could tell you, being on the consulting side, my initial reaction is that I felt like I was more comfortable with the middle market, and by the middle market, the 100 to a billion is kind of how I would kind of define it, or maybe a $5 billion range, but versus the $50 billion range, at least when we were looking at it on the M&A front, because it was just so hard to get your arms around what the company really was in its entirety when you're talking about a $50 billion company. All that being said, it was interesting, though, when I decided to leave the consulting world, I joined that $50 billion business. I can tell you some of the things that were attractive to me at the time was one was position specific, in that I was working in the M&A group at Sears at the time. So this was in the early 2000 era, and there was a lot of change ultimately going on. On the buy side, we had Land's End acquisition. On the sell side, we were divesting of our credit business. So just a lot of activity to an M&A and a deal guy was very invigorating. But I can tell you, after kind of spending, it wound up being about 3.5, 4 years at Sears, it was just kind of interesting to actually implement change within a company that, like I said, at the time it was probably 40 or 50 billion a year in revenue. And I guess when I say to implement change at a larger company, it was just a lot harder. And I'll just kind of draw a connection, like simply on an M&A front, of if we were going to look at buying a deal at Sears, I would probably have a team underneath me that, for the Land's End acquisition, we probably had 70 people that worked on it. I probably had 5 different HR people that were focused on, whether it's, employee relations or benefits, yada, 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 right? And then when I kind of went on further in my career, which I'll get to in a minute, but more on that, when I was in my next 2 roles, which again, you could think of it in the hundreds of millions to, a few billion, you could have 1 or 2 HR people. So your 70 group team all of a sudden turned into a 15 group team. And to actually institute change and actually get relatively major decisions done were just so much easier, and you're so much more agile, was kind of what the attractive part was from my perspective, which is kind of what caused me to kind of take a look at kind of leaving the safety net, I guess, as you put it, Mike, of a big company, which I'll kind of get back to in the net, because I'm not sure how much of a safety net it really is in today's environment. But I ultimately left Sears, and then I joined, and I headed up the M&A group at a company by the name of Serva, which was a global relocation and transportation company. Probably as a consumer perspective, you would be familiar in that we own the brand names to Allied Van Lines and North American Van Lines, which I'm sure you've seen those trucks on the roads. That's run through an agency model, but nonetheless, that was about half of our business, and then the other half was global relocations, and that was about a $4 billion business. And the difference between going from a $40 billion business to a $4 billion business was noticeable, with just regards to your ability, like I said, the agility that you have as a smaller company, I just think is so much more rewarding than when you get into a Fortune 50 company. And I ultimately put it, when I think about the bigger companies, if it truly is the number one thing that, let's say, a GE is going to do, and you've got the CEO at the company is really pushing it, that initiative, I truly do think will happen relatively quickly at no matter what size company you are. So it's not necessarily the most important thing that really changes. But when you drop down to number 3, or you're talking about initiative 3 through 10, where the CEO or the senior management team really wants it, but it's not the top thing on their list. Things just take much longer, and it's just a much slower process. I ultimately left there, and then I joined a Berkshire Hathaway-owned company, which is here in Chicago, by the name of Pampered Chef, and I've been there ever since. That's smaller than the $4 billion. It's about $500 million a year in revenue, but not too dissimilar, to be quite honest with you, from the $4 billion experience. I would say, the only other point I would say is I think about, which I think just to comment on what you mentioned, Ram, the ability, I guess I've had throughout my career is that if I would have stayed, I felt like in a larger company, that it was just going to be an extremely long road. And I think, as I look back on the experiences, whether it's on the consulting side or when I was there, is that you have a lot of expertise in a big company. They have tremendous scale. If you have an issue on a specific matter, usually they've got an expert that knows everything about that matter. One of the trade-offs, I think, of ultimately going to a smaller company is that you have less resources that are true experts, and you got more of a generalist, which really kind of appealed to my background, as opposed to kind of getting very, very narrow in a certain area. It kind of allows you the opportunity, if you've got the right mindset, to kind of expand your roles and responsibilities that I felt like I could never get within a bigger company. So that's kind of
Okay, great, thanks. I guess I wanted to start with kind of I'm an economist, costs and benefits, but let's talk about benefits first. And what I heard from you guys was a couple of things that were similar. Frustration with the structure of large organizations, number one. Inability to run my show, at least 2 of you said. And related to that, can be hard to implement change. So I was wondering if you guys could talk to each other a little bit about how your jobs changed in positive ways when you made these transitions. What was good about the switch? So, for example, Ram said that he's had exposure to boards, which would not have happened probably at GE. That's one example, but if you guys could talk to each other a little bit about that.
Yeah, I might jump a little bit on Jim's comment on change, because I think, at the large company, at the GE, there's a lot of specialization in functions. There's a lot of structure, and there's a lot of kind of matrix type organization structure, which requires a lot of consensus to drive change. You have to get a lot of you have to have a whole, teach you an entire training process, right? You're living through it of how to do change management and get people to buy in and get stakeholders to buy into driving change. And you serve 6 to 15 masters, and there's a lot of people that have to kind of agree, and you have to keep them in agreement all the time before you get to a point where you're going to
right. And very rarely is there only 1 or 2 decision makers in a large company. I mean, your point is 100% accurate.
In the small company,
it's a big group.
The flip side, and small is all relative. I work in a $400+ million company, but the flip side is I almost have the opposite thing, which is cool. If I want to drive change, I have a pretty clear mandate. I can just say we're going to change X, Y, and Z, and we change it. The problem is sometimes the inexperience that exists in our business, because a lot of our people grew up with the company from startup phase, so they have not seen, it's not that they're not smart, it's not that they're not really capable or competent, they just haven't seen a lot of flavors of every situation. Everything's typically like the first time we run into it. So the flip side is I don't have any checks and balances anymore, so when I say something really stupid and have a really bad idea, it happens. So, the flip side at the GE is I had enough people to kind of counterbalance my dumb ideas with the good ones and correct them a little enough so that I took away some of the risks in what I was doing. Here, I realized quickly, I got to be careful what I ask for, because I'm going to get it. And sometimes I'm just talking, with the team about an idea, and before I know it, it's gone and done, and it wasn't necessarily a good idea. So I've learned that I've had to balance the two. You have to kind of realize that you can on the one hand have the power, empowerment to come up with the ideas and drive change, but be careful how
So you have the
Well, it's
abil-
funny, I had the same experience on a much smaller scale. When I acquired Graphic, the first decision I made and told the entire team was, we're not changing anything for 6 months. You're going to teach me everything there is to know about this business. And after that point, we're going to discuss what direction we need to head in and change and all that. And as it turns out, that was one of the smartest things I could have done, because there wasn't a lot that was broken. I ended up, at the outset anyway, acquiring a nonprofit. I had no intention of acquiring a nonprofit, but that's where we were. And ultimately, what came out of that whole exercise and the discussions were some really good ideas came out of this. These people have been in this career path for, in some cases, decades. They know what to do. They just needed some leadership and guidance. And I think your point is absolutely right. Have I made all the correct decisions along the way? The answer is unequivocally no. But the beauty of a small company such as ours is if I want to change our mind at 2 o'clock this afternoon, it's changed. We've done a fair amount of that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, and I think like a good example would be, okay, so I'm in the M&A group at Sears, and then I get hired into the M&A group at a much smaller company, and I'm leading that. So the M&A group also included strategy at the smaller company. So at Sears, these were two separate, distinct organizations, where you're kind of going, again, from a level of expertise in Sears, and then you've got broader responsibilities as you kind of move into, at least in my case, into the smaller organization. I could ultimately say that, as I kind of moved even past that throughout my career, it's also when you've got, at least my experience has been, when you're in the bigger organization, and less, because there are so many people and they've got such a level of expertise that as you want to kind of move outside of your area into, let's say, a new position that's kind of opening up within the company, that you're going to be probably competing with somebody who that's their core area of expertise, where it's not yours. So you may be good from a general perspective, but it's just harder to kind of pop around. I'll just kind of throw one example out. After I was in charge of the M&A, the county, or I should say the company I was with, ran into a bunch of accounting problems. They had SEC investigations, class action lawsuits, yada, yada, yada. And the board came to me and said, we want you to ultimately become our chief accounting officer. Now, mind you, I have my accounting degree from undergrad. I spent 4 years doing auditing, but I hadn't done a debit or credit or even talked about one in about 11 years. And I can't help but thinking that if I was in a big company, I would never have been afforded that responsibility, because they weren't necessarily looking for the best accountant, because
You did have Catherine Schipper teach you accounting, though.
I did, so I
That's
felt
pretty
very
hardcore.
fortunate for that, yeah. But,
She was tougher than Roman Wheel, for those
yeah.
who don't know her.
But I guess the point of it was, and I kind of brought it up to the board at the time, I said, now realize that, we're publicly traded, like I said, SEC investigation, all this, that there's going to be, if you haven't considered it, that there's this potential of somebody's going to say, well, what the heck did you just do? Why are you bringing somebody in to run a mess of an accounting organization? It's about 400 people worldwide. We had material weaknesses that hit every one of our lines in our financial statements, and this guy hasn't ever done accounting. And the response was, you know what, you could go hire a great accountant. What we want somebody with is good management skills, because we don't understand what the accounting folks are telling us, and we think you'll be a good bridge for it, as well as your ability to manage. So I just think it definitely opened up avenues and doors that, like I said, I ultimately get back to that level of expertise, and sometimes it's a pretty narrow career path the farther you kind of get along with the big companies. But.
Yeah, I agree.
Which I can't imagine is, or would be the case, any different with GE.
Yeah.
Even more so. But.
I think another pro for me, it's a pro and a con in some ways, but mostly a pro, is I think what I do matters more. At least there's a self-perception that what I do matters more. I ran a business at GE is bigger than the entire company I'm in now, but if I made or missed my numbers, my boss got pissed off, but it really didn't affect GE's stock price. I was like a blip in the pool of this, a $600 million business and a $165 billion company was like a rounding error somewhere, And so it didn't really matter. There was still pressure, as you can imagine, but it wasn't the same thing. Here, I miss a quarter, which I haven't missed a quarter yet since you're recording. But if I missed a quarter, it would have an effect on, material effect on what we report out in terms of earnings or out to the street. And so that's one example of many. All the things that we're measuring ourselves on. There's direct line of sight to, reward and recognition, both from a market perspective and even from an employee and cultural perspective. The things you do in the organization has a profound and significant effect in a bigger way than I think you can in a really large company, which has a lot of that just structure in place, and you kind of own pieces and parts that are pretty far removed from the overall top of the chain.
It's interesting, your point about important work, because obviously in my case, I feel very strongly that what we do is important. We're looking out for preserving history, literally. And if you see the condition of some of the things that come into us, it's necessary. It's such a narrowly focused, niche-oriented business that there's a lot of opportunity that comes along with that. I'll also say that one of the things I was really looking for was the ability to differentiate a business from others. And I didn't have much of that with where I was before. As I said before, it was all about acquiring share, whether it was IRI retail scans in the food business or share in the paper industry. That ultimately didn't do a lot for me. What is different today is the numbers are a rounding error on Ram's balance sheet today. But you know something? I'm okay with that. I've got a business and I can share numbers because I have no downside. Our first quarter year to date, we're up 105% over the prior year. So I'm very proud of that type of accomplishment for obvious reasons. And the other thing and maybe we'll get to this at some point, but when I got out of school 30 years ago, I framed my career, and I'm sure many of you did as well, in terms of
How old are you, 8?
living with something like that, a company for my career, or a good portion of it, not much moving around. You also had this finite start-stop mentality of, at 65 or whatever, you're done, and it's time to move off into something else. Well, I don't know if, first of all, like I'm sure a lot of you, we're A-type driven, motivated, highly energetic personalities. The concept of turning it off isn't very appealing. So for me, I needed to find an outlet for that, and running my own show does just that. I may do this until I'm 80, and I'm perfectly okay with that. I have no desire to stop. Maybe my work schedule will change in a few years, and I'll do the European model of vacations of 8 to 12 weeks a year or whatever. But at least I'll have an organization in place that I'm comfortable with doing that through. And there are a lot of self-serving reasons behind what I did, in addition to Ram's point of it's important work.
Yeah, I'd say from my perspective, if we wanted to enact change, and again, I put it into two different buckets. If it truly is entering into a new business, whether it's at GE or any other Fortune 50 company, and the CEO, that's the number one thing on his list, that will happen, and that will happen quickly. But if it kind of falls into that middle or second tier, it's just a lot harder unless if it's terribly critical to the company to actually get done, where in a smaller company, much like you, Russ and Ram, literally if we want to enact change, we could probably get it done, at least conceptually get agreement on it after kind of all the internal diligence is done, within the course of 2 or 3 meetings, as opposed to necessarily trying to corral the horde of people that you essentially have to kind of do when you're dealing with a very large, complicated, complex organization that requires the sign off of a group of 30. It just takes longer.
Can you guys speak to the question of how your job changed? What I mean by that is just day to day. I mean, okay, you had to learn about some board and governance issues. You maybe had to learn a little accounting, or a little more accounting and so forth. But sort of more on a day-to-day, how did it differ from the job before?
Absolutely. There's a couple of things. One is I've got a very low threshold of boredom, so I need to be challenging myself with new things. And as you can tell, moved from paper to food. Now I'm in conservation, totally different worlds. So learning the business is very exciting to me and trying to improve the business and so forth. That's one part of it. The other kind of subliminal part of it is, you know, until you actually own it and it is 100% your responsibility, the payroll is your responsibility for the families that are taking advantage of that payroll, that's all you. And you lose that in a larger organization. I just feel that. I felt that when I was involved with one. There was enough cash flow in the business that was never even a concern. Well, you know, when you're working with a very small organization, that's a very real thing. And for those that aren't ready to deal with that, that's not a good thing. And the other thing is it forces, I think, a critical self-assessment of what you're good at and what you're not good at. And face it, both of those exist within you. And in my case specifically, you know, throughout my career, but certainly here, you know, I tried to take my skill sets, sales, marketing, general management, analytics, direction of the business, things along those lines, and tried to, you know, basically carry the organization to the next level, utilizing the balance of the skills that were available in the organization. You know, I tell our team this all the time. I've got the easiest job in the world. All I need to do is tell the world about what you do. It's a pretty easy job. A little more to it than that, but you know, at the end of the day, that's what I'm doing. And again, I think that critical self-assessment prior to engaging in a transaction where you're literally going to become the owner of the company, you got to understand there's a lot to that. I will never forget the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It's been mentioned several times, but we've worked on a copy of the Gettysburg Address. We've worked on a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. You know, it's lots of very interesting, historically significant works. We had the 13th Amendment delivered to us at night under state police escort. Nobody knew it was in our lab, for obvious reasons. The media was brought in to cover the story a day before we released it back to the museum. So we've got the Associated Press running with it, we've got the Trib running with it, we've got TV running. It's, you know, for a company our size, getting that kind of national publicity was a big, big deal. We were in 200 newspapers overnight as a result of the work we did. The Associated Press, well, what I didn't know about the media was, you know, it's a feeding frenzy out there, and everybody's trying to get a jump on everyone else. And everyone had buy-in that no one was going to run with this story until the state police escort left our building. I did not want anyone knowing that was in the lab. I mean, it's priceless, literally. Well, one of the media organizations ran with it, and with the speed of the internet, it was out there at 8 o'clock the night before the people were supposed to come in and get it. I have never had a worse night in my life knowing that it was public information that this document was in our lab. And that's that ownership thing, you know. I felt it big time. And as I said, there's a lot to it. And for those of you that haven't owned a company before, just be very critical of yourself and what you're good at and what you're not good at.
I would say for mine, the first thing I noticed was, and I mentioned it earlier, the level of resources are such that if you have a question on whatever ABC topic, you could call somebody up and you had an expert at your disposal. Now all of a sudden, depending on what the topic is, you may not have that expert at your disposal. So it required, at least me in my case, and it still exists today, that I would argue that if you're not willing to essentially roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty in some fashion, moving to a smaller enterprise is not a good idea. Because I think inevitably you have to get more into the detail than you do in a larger organization. I think probably depending on how small the organization is, probably fits whatever your personality is as to kind of where that fits. I would imagine, I've never been in a startup, but I would imagine in a startup, you're doing everything from turning on the lights to making coffee in the morning, yada, 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 right? And it kind of changes as you kind of move up on the scale side. But I would say whenever you move down, you should just inherently have the expectation or the desire and the will to essentially take on more of a generalist and more detail than you otherwise would, just because you are not going to have the same level of resources at a smaller company than you will at a larger company.
Yeah, maybe to build on that and kind of marry both of your responses, the other piece that I think I sort of knew intellectually going in, but I'm now experiencing, a little bit more day to day is there's a shift in the amount of professional equity that you get and give when you make the switch. I would say, at a GE, for example, there is just some of the most amazing world-class management leadership training that you're going to get. Really, that's the external buzz on GE, and it's true. I mean, the amount of focus and attention on professional development of people is immense. And so and then the number of people with lots of experience and decades of experience in their functions and global business and whatever it might be, like Jim was saying, there's a lot of people with functional and broad business experience that you're always learning from a coaching and leadership perspective, and there's programs and structures for all that. And all that is there, so whatever you're giving to your teams in the business, you're also getting in return from the company. I think, for me, the biggest daily awakening at times is the fact that I actually don't get as much professional equity from where I'm at. I'm giving a lot more, and that's okay, but it's okay. It's just recognizing the responsibility, to your point, of that's what people are looking to you for now, and you're spending a lot more of my time, teaching or coaching or getting involved or bringing in the right experts to help the team solve problems that I don't know about. It's me kind of going out and bringing a lot more equity to the team and being responsible for my own professional development going forward. More than having a built-in kind of infrastructure that's out kind of taking care of you and growing you up. That's a pretty big difference, in sort of in the two, and it's like not good or bad, like I was saying. It's just a difference, and I kind of recognized it, and it's good to know it because you sort of lean on that for a little while, and then you grow up and graduate out of that and move on. And
Right, you got to move out of the house.
yeah, you got to move out of the house, right? So, and that's kind of what it felt like. When I left, it wasn't like a divorce; it was like leaving the home for college.
Yeah, no, I know from my perspective, and I couldn't agree more that, to be honest with you, and I do think it just depends on your personality, your likes, your dislikes. I know from my perspective, I think I benefited greatly from being in a large multinational consulting firm and then moving into a large corporation because I guess I felt like I was receiving more, maybe as much, but probably more than I was essentially giving because of that infrastructure and everything else, and you were able to kind of learn from all the experts. And I know from my perspective, as I look back on it, if I had to do it all over again, I would do something similar in that I would probably start out bigger and kind of move smaller because I think it gave me a certain level of foundation and knowledge that I'm not sure that I would have gotten in at a smaller company, because much like you, I think it's much more giving than receiving now, just because I think whenever you elevate throughout an organization, that's always going to be the case, and you're probably going to accelerate your rise within a corporation if you move down in size.
So this just sounds like a terrible situation. More responsibility and wider responsibility, financial and people and so forth, and investors, means great potential to add value and improve people's lives. It means if you screw up, it's really costly. Mm-hmm. The cost of your mistakes is really high, right? Don't blow it. And your skills you have less developed skills in some sense. You have specialized skills, but you need broader skills. There are things that you didn't grow up doing for 15 years or something. And maybe lack of information, lack of expertise you can draw on that you could in a big organization, lack of resources to support. That just sounds terrible to me. So can you guys talk about the following things? Given that, first of all, how would you learn to become more, how did you learn to become, or how, in your case, are you trying to become more comfortable with making decisions with imperfect knowledge and imperfect expertise, knowing that you just don't know as much as you would in a Sears or a GE or something? How do you overcome your innate risk aversion? Because there's more risk in what you're doing. Your mistakes matter. And then how do you get up the learning curve faster, since you can't just draw on other people? Those are related, of course.
Sure. Well, Mike, I'll go back.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have till 4 o'clock. Thank you.
We have till 4 o'clock to answer this question, is that what you're saying?
I do personally.
No.
Wow, that's a long question.
We have, I'm sure, yes. And we have to open the Q&A soon, so.
Yeah, I'll go back to the
Be quick.
point I made earlier about the first decision was to make no change for a period of time. And the reason for that was very simple. I needed to learn. And fortunately for me, I had a phenomenal group of teachers teaching me the business, the industry, how it is the company has operated historically. I think that, to be honest with you, everyone here has the skill sets in terms of one side of the brain to, make things happen, certainly analytically, certainly understanding what drives a business. But when you get smaller in size, there's a dimension here that I think you need to be aware of, and that's people skills. It's huge. And I don't know that enough emphasis is placed on that. And beyond people skills, I'll divide that further down into listening skills. You don't have all of the answers, which I think is your point. You don't, nor will you ever. And all you can do is hope to be reasonably right all of the time. And so long as you've got yourself surrounded with a team of experts or close to experts, you've got a lot of help in making those decisions, and you should take advantage of it. In our case specifically, as I said, I knew nothing about this business. And candidly, that was refreshing. I really liked the challenge of that.
So Russ, what would you tell Rom, who doesn't have that group who've already figured out how to do this business? They're young, inexperienced, they just did an IPO. It seems like the opposite situation. What would you advise him, since he's new to this?
I'm going to take your pen.
And the cost of your mistake will be high for Rom's career.
That's right. Okay. Well,
You guys are recording this, right?
fortunately, I loaded up on calls on his company before the conversation.
Not puts?
Look, I hate to say it, but it's a recurring theme in my business about relationships. Whenever I have a tour go through the lab, the first thing I start off with, and believe me, we'll get to this, the point. The first thing I say is, what's the archival value of a tweet? The generation that's coming up right now does not understand relationships nearly as well as people did decades ago. It's just that simple. And I don't mean to be too crass with that comment, but it's been my experience. And I've got a lot of these people on our staff. It's communicating with a completely different type of person. I've never been accustomed to that. And it sounds like that's the group that you're dealing with. It's amazing, though, in our case, at some level, the motivations for success have changed within this group. They're looking for different things than more than likely you and I were looking for at a similar age. And finding a way to connect with what it is they're looking for can be resoundingly successful. I've got a half a dozen or so on the payroll that are in that age group. And it's astonishing to me the level of dedication and interest they really have in what's going on. And they tend to be more cause-oriented and a little more connected to ethereal types of things than what you and I may have been connected with. Again, my success with this group in particular has come through listening and understanding, and above all, not being judgmental. And believe me, it's tempting. And I don't know that that's an answer to the question, but it's helped me quite a bit with that age group.
Can you add any more advice for young Ron here?
For young Rob. I don't know if I could add any
Or
advice to him
remember
or
my
not,
lengthy question.
But yeah, I do remember it. And I guess I'll be brief on this. So on the expertise, it's relatively easy from my perspective. You or I today outsource more than I did before.
Yeah.
So I call up, if I got a problem in HR, I've got a great HR benefits firm. And you know what? They know everything. So you kind of use them on an ad hoc basis. That's quite frequent. We use them far more outside experts than we did, where else I was. And then, and when I talk about the expertise internally, at least my experience has been, it's much more focused on the tactical. Like I said, you've got an HR benefits problem. How do you get this resolved, or are we in violation of some, local law or regulation? I outsource it. Your other broader question, as it relates to dealing with imperfect knowledge, that at least I took it to be kind of more on a strategic level. Mm-hmm. I guess I found the lack of expertise to really be focused more on the tactical level of day-to-day business problems. And as it relates to strategic direction within the company and more of the macro issues of whether you should enter into this market or how do you approach the market with this consumer product, yada, yada, yada. I personally think that the level of information that has existed across, I guess, 3 of the companies that I've been with has been pretty similar. You kind of do your diligence until you get to a level that you feel is comfortable. And even within a large organization, you're never going to have 100% of all the facts anyway. So it always winds up being, just a general rule of thumb, 80-20, and you kind of go with the information you've got. So you always have a level of imperfect information and knowledge. But anyway,
Yeah, I mean, just to react to your question, you asked a question on risk and imperfect knowledge, and I appreciate both of the comments from these guys. I think they're right on with the imperfect knowledge. At a larger company, you have imperfect knowledge there too. You just have prettier PowerPoints and Excel spreadsheets to make you feel more confident about how little you know. And you sell it to a lot of people that aren't deep about it. So as long as it looks good and you sell it, people buy it. And you realize that at some point that you're sort of fooling yourself to think you really know exactly what you're doing with the data and that you're managing. There's still always a level of imperfection. There's a little level of intuition, and there's a level of risk. And that doesn't change. So that part doesn't change. Maybe I'm a little bit. The stakes are higher. But let's start with that. The one is I can release the pretense that the knowledge and information is perfect, and I can at least acknowledge that there's risk inherent in the information that I'm using to make decisions. And so I can be a little bit more transparent about that and get people to kind of understand that there's risk inherent. The second is, Mike, I think the risk is what I seek. So I left because the risk wasn't there enough. And culturally, it is difficult for people to take risks in a big company because you have a lot of people who have lifelong careers there that may be making choices and decisions based on protecting that career over taking risks. And I think when you move into a small organization, the opportunity to take risks increases. That's what I think I seek. I want to kind of live and die by the ability to take that risk. So the upside is there, the downside is there. That's okay as long as you kind of go into it knowing that. To me, it's totally fine. Culturally, with the sort of younger workforce, there are a lot more impatient people in my organization now that are wanting us to take risks. So if you don't take those risks, you risk people saying, screw you, I'm going to move to the next company that will take those risks. And those are the sort of imbalances that occur, and it sort of becomes a culture of risk-taking. And you have to be comfortable with it, I'd say, more than anything, and be okay that you can drive change, you can take risks, but the stakes are high. If you fail, you move on, and you have to be ready. I mean, I think I'm mentally prepared not to have a 15-year career at this company. That I'll either do well or I'll be popping around a few times till it works out. I mean,
yeah, I don't want anyone to misinterpret these comments because I do think it's higher risk being in a smaller company than in a larger company. But we recently we're doing it for some reason that is irrelevant here. But we went back to, I think I had them go back to 1950 or 1960, and we pulled, I think it was the top 50 or the top 100 market cap companies in 1950 or 60, just at a point in time, and said, well, where are they today? And it's amazing if you were to take out oil as to how many of those companies that are either still around.
Hey, even Sears. Barely.
Or have gone through substantial changes in of themselves, right? So you still have the auto companies around. You have your Chrysler, but they're still around in name, right? But same with GM, and GE is actually one of the few exceptions on that list, in that they were in the Fortune 20 in 1960, and they're in the Fortune 20 now. So,
although the one thing we would say within GE is the businesses we were in 10 years ago
yeah,
are
vastly
not the same
different, right? So,
10 years later.
So I don't know. I just say that it's not riskless to be within a large corporation because I do think it probably takes longer, and the cost of failure is shorter in the long run. But I think if you kind of look over a longer time paradigm, that the larger companies that don't act and don't react, like a GE maybe has done going into new businesses, that they wind up having their own issues as well.
And putting a fine point on that risk element, again, when you're looking at a small organization and you're doing all of your due diligence and homework and you're getting excited about the opportunity, you do create, there's a bias within yourself that you are going to be successful with this. You are going to expect more things to come of it than necessarily may come from it. I can't caution you enough in terms of watching out for your personal bias, in terms of what you are capable of, what the organization is capable of in a reasonable period of time. As you're doing your homework and your performance and the trees are growing to the sky and it's nothing but wonderful things from here on out, take a step back and say, okay, well, what if 50% of my objective actually materializes, or some other number? You need to be prepared for that. And if you're doing the deal with partners, I mean, within the first 18 months, you do not want to have capital calls. That is not a good thing. So, you know, being prepared for all of the outcomes in advance of pulling the trigger on the deal are extremely important. And to some extent, you do mitigate and control the risk factors associated with that deal just based on your personal biases. Tamp them down. Tamp them down.
Yeah, and to that point, you know, as you get into, you know, depending on what kind of capital structure you have, you know, the old adage, which we've all been taught, cash is king. Mm-hmm. You really know it when you're trying to either meet that covenant ratio,
absolutely,
or you're trying to meet the payroll or whatnot, and it definitely is an area of focus, especially with my background being in finance, that you know, you spend a great deal of time focused on those issues because of exactly what you said.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway.
So I have a ton more questions for you, and I'd kind of like to push you harder because that's what professors do. But we have a lot of people in the room who probably have questions. So let's go to the gentleman right in the back. Let me say first, though, we are recording this to post on the web, and we have microphones and you guys don't. So if you can, speak relatively loudly as though you're in a classroom. But I'm probably going to repeat your question just to make sure we get it on tape. Thanks. So the question was, how did this affect personal life and work-life balance? Great question.
Well, in my case specifically, I'll go back to a comment I made earlier. When you do what you want to do as opposed to what you have to do, it's a remarkable change in how you view the world. And I can tell you that I work more hours today than I probably ever have, but I am perfectly okay with that, primarily because I enjoy what we're building. There's also an aspect to it of, again, when you are 100% in control of it, and you're willing, and you get to enjoy seeing the successes that you build along the way, there is no better feeling in the world in terms of your career with regard to that. I never achieved that level of personal satisfaction in any corporate opportunity I've ever had. Sure, there are moments along the way when things went well, but you know, when you score a major coup and you can see it in the people that you work with and the opportunities it creates for them, and it all just kind of has this mushrooming effect, it's a remarkable experience. So it's been extremely positive for me.
Yeah, I used to dress like these guys, and you know, I live in San Diego now.
We follow
the weather's
instructions.
Perfect.
I thought these.
But, you know, the first thing I
Instructions.
had to do was flush my wardrobe and like buy jeans and stuff. So that was that. No, just to give a comment. Look, I think to his point, I actually made my change while I was still in the XP program. My wife was 6 months pregnant. I changed jobs, cities, towns, bought a house. I did probably everything stressful you could put in one package. I had hair. I don't now. That was I think the whole process was pretty stressful for me. But I think you know, you kind of get through it, and I think you know, it had an effect on my family in some ways that were, you know, intense, but in other ways, I traveled 130,000 miles when I was at GE in 8 months 1 year, and I had 2 little kids, and I'm running a domestic business now, so I don't travel as much. I'm home a lot more, you know, as a whole. So I think no matter what, if you're kind of an intense career-focused person, and you feel the sense of like responsibility you have to your employees, your workforce, and your customers, you're going to end up probably, working a lot one way or the other, and you just kind of know that about yourself, and hopefully find a way to balance it. There's no.
Yeah, mine would be the same. Mine is a push. Typical type A personality, so I usually dive in, and yeah, I haven't noticed any difference at all.
As I listen to you guys, it kind of occurs to me that that the agency issues that kind of resolve into separation management, ownership, are more about just alignment of economic interests, but also about engaging personal aspirations in a way. And reflect on that, if you will, and then maybe talk about how that.
I need to repeat that question for the microphone. That's going to be a little challenging. So the question first used agency theory, separation of ownership and control. Showing your Chicago booth chops there, that's nice. And then asked about how that relates to personal aspirations and in your motivation in running your organization and motivating your people. Would that be a fair, brief summary? Thanks.
Really aligned now, but it seems to be more than just about having the economic interests that align with the company. It seems to also be about fulfilling a lot of personal aspirations. That makes me think that there's more to the agency that we talk about than aligning our company's interests. And that should, if you believe that to be true, it should feed down into how you manage your employees today. You may not believe it to be true on every.
Yeah, I'll take first step out. And I want to build on something Russ said earlier, which is kind of getting a sense of purpose in what you're doing. And the company I joined, when I first joined, we're a SaaS company, software as a service. Most of our business model is a fee per transaction that our customers, each transaction our customer does with their own consumer, we get a piece of that. And when I got there, all everyone ever talked to me about were transactions. That was like everyone talked in units of labor and transactions, and nobody talked about customers. No one talked about kind of why we were in business. The sort of soul of the company, the teams, sort of dissipated over time as they got bigger and became a little bit more tried to become more what they thought or perceived of as corporate, and they started looking at their spreadsheets and started looking inward instead of outward. And I'd say one of the biggest things that I have a lot of pleasure from in my first year is spending a lot of time recreating purpose and getting people realigned into the mission and purpose of why we're in business, and re-articulating a lot of our company metrics and measures around advancing that purpose, and not just being, the end result's the same. It's still about growing the top line revenue, et cetera, but instead of talking about transactions, we talked about participation. So Chicago Parks District is one of our customers here in the city, and it's 2.8 million people in Chicago. And they have somewhere in the 400,000 range of number of participants that they have go through the program. Well, I meet with the superintendent of the Parks District, and their number one thing they get measured on is participation, that ratio, number of people that do their programs versus number of population, and the number of times they repeat participation. So that's now our whole mantra is participation. If I double the participation in the city of Chicago and the Parks District, I double my revenue. And it's that simple. We used to just call it transactions, and everyone got kind of lost around the internal operating metrics. It's the same thing. It's just kind of reshaping it, realigning what we do around what we're doing for customers, and getting people fired up. I was in healthcare for 10 years. We're focused on diagnostic care, finding and treating diseases after it happened. The business I'm in now is about getting people active and preventing disease to begin with. And you can being able to stitch that story, that vision and strategy, build a strategy around it, and articulating, business metrics in a way that advance that purpose, that I've felt full control of, and have felt it make a pretty profound impact on morale and performance. hope that answered your question. Always.
Yeah, and in our case, it's kind of a utopian view, and maybe it's a little backward, but I firmly believe that if our company does all the right things, or at least majority of the right things in terms of structuring the business, growing the business, reaching out to clients, maintaining good, solid relationships, and coincident with that, we have the finest talent pool available within the organization, good things will come from that. And as a direct result of that, you know, I kind of view myself at the back end of that train, that the team that I have, because of how good they are, you don't end up with one of the 26 original broadsides of the Declaration of Independence unless you are the best at what you do. And it took me a nanosecond to figure that out one day. And consequently, it's my belief that the team that has, and we're all very privileged to work with each other and to work with the things that we work on, they should be the highest paid in this industry, period. And we have structures in place now that actually reward these folks for that, which candidly, they never would have seen before. Never. They're now part of a growth company, whereas before it was a company that was struggling to exist. Two completely different mentalities. And their participation in the upside of this business is rather substantial.
We don't have to get you all three of you answering every question, I guess. I don't know if you want to weigh in or not. Just make sure we get some more questions in. Sure. Who would like to ask a question?
How do you avoid bureaucracy? I'm using the sense that involved in training large corporations who have hierarchies and processes and procedures. That's the way you work, train, build, how to avoid not carrying that into your new organization as one thing you want to do.
So the question is, how do you avoid bureaucracy? How do you avoid, in effect, replicating what you left?
You know, I think I'll take the first shot at it. One is it's incredibly harder to do in a smaller organization than in a larger company, just from the standpoint of you don't have the resources to make it as bureaucratic. But I think other than just but I do think you have a valid point in there in that you could kind of take a company that is very nimble and you could kind of put in a bunch of roadblocks all by yourself, and now all of a sudden you've taken a nimble company and you've kind of made it a miniature version of kind of where you came from. Really the only thing I could add on that is that I think it's incumbent upon each one of the leaders to not only reflect internally, but hopefully you have a broader management team that you solicit advice from your fellow peers within the company to make sure that you're kind of taking their input into consideration as well. I know that is something that we do on a regular basis of essentially 360 evaluations, not only for the people that report to me, but also just peer-to-peer evaluations to just kind of hopefully have open dialogue to make sure that if you are stifling innovation or something of that ilk, that you're aware of it, because sometimes I'm the last one to know that I'm doing something that is maybe causing issues either within my group or within other groups. So.
And in our case, I came from a larger organization into a micro version of that organization, and the way that small companies tend to view the world is completely different. I mean, the culture of the company you couldn't get more different than what I was accustomed to. Your temptation is to want to organize and regiment and structure, and in our case, that would have been the worst thing I could have done. It boils down to weekly meetings of all the projects that are in-house and just trying to manage the workflow and, frankly, how to keep up with it. You know, these are new problems that we have, and we've had to institute some new systems as a result of that, which have, frankly, increased a little of the bureaucracy and the red tape within the company. But, those are growth problems, which I think everyone that's on board now and has seen the transition in the company over the last 3 to 4 or 5 years actually relishes.
Maybe I'll take a slightly different, it's a great question, a slightly different twist on your question. One of the things I was self-reflecting on as I was making the change and had kind of maybe personal doubts on my kind of capability or ability was whether or not I was a product of being really good at the system of GE or if I was actually effective as a manager or a leader. And so maybe to kind of, that maybe I wore on my sleeve when I made the transition, which is, can I be equally successful using some of the tools that make me who I am as a leader, but abandon a lot of the structure and bureaucracy and be successful. Was I in fact successful because I was good at the bureaucracy, or can I kind of be good without it? That was kind of at the core of my own like self-assessment and maybe risks for myself when I took this job, and I sort of kept it at the forefront a lot. And you know, to your point, I was pretty transparent about that with my staff when I first joined. So kind of we got them together and we sort of talked about how I would be as a leader, and I sort of made it clear that it was their job to call bullshit, and what I was doing is over-engineering or over-architecting the team and just making sure that I'm getting that feedback. But it was one of the things I wanted to test or to see if I'd be successful at without that, and I don't miss it, for sure.
Okay, so the question was, you talked about a lot of factors in making the transition, but compensation wasn't one you mentioned. Why?
Yeah, the only short answer I would have on that, and that's, I think, somewhat to touch on Russ's comment earlier, that I can tell you that, well, from a personal perspective, there's a certain base level of comp, and you know, you work hard and you expect to be compensated for it. But whether or not you were going to get a bigger equity package here versus here and kind of all that, that was purely secondary to essentially what, from a will perspective, do you really want to do? And assuming that the economics worked out in the end, that you know, whether you would have made money at the other larger company over the short term or the longer term, really wasn't that big of a factor, at least from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, and obviously in my case, small company, as I said, we started out as a non-for-profit, so you take a couple of years it hits, and kind of goes back to my earlier comment about your personal biases and understanding your personal reserves and investing into something like this, should you choose to go it alone, or certainly with partners, it's important. Candidly, that was a secondary consideration for me. I knew that, again, given the certain moves that we were about to make, there was no question in my mind that the opportunity over the long run was going to be there for me personally. And that's important in terms of being able to articulate your personal exit strategy for what you're looking to do. I know exactly what that is. I know exactly what the story is going to look like when it will be told ultimately. I'm the guy that's in control of that, so that has a lot to do with it. In my case, it's interesting. With a small company, this may sound foolish, but I'm more concerned about the team and where they're at and them being able to experience growth as a result of our company's success than looking out for me personally. I know at the end of the day that's going to be there. I'm not worried about that. I'm in and perhaps many of you are in an unusual situation that way, and you can afford to make bold, rash statements like that, but that truly is my case. And we will be successful, no doubt.
Well, yeah, I think you were also just poking at like the decision to leave, like, you know, and I'd say, you know, to be transparent, my own personal economic gain was a factor. I mean, all these other things are critical, and they differentiate what I chose to leave from, but the potential to accelerate personal gain from a smaller company by getting a larger share of equity, which obviously comes with as much risk as it did upside, but at least to have a shot was a factor in leaving. But all these other things are the factor in what I chose and what I looked for, because the risk range for the upside it's wide. You know, the likelihood of not getting any upside is just as good as the likelihood of attaining it. So that's not you're looking for that dynamic, but if you expect that to make you professionally satisfied, it's not going to happen. You know, you need all this other stuff, I think, or you're not going to wake up fired up to go to work every day. You're going to lose sight of what you're doing day to day. But you know, economic gain was certainly at the forefront of leaving, because I think it's a slow linear pace at a large company, and there's the potential for a quick jump, but there's also the potential for not. I mean, our stock went from $18 to $3 in my first year and a half, and I was at the wrong 15-year juncture at GE too. I might be bad luck, because if I'd worked at GE the 15 years before I was there, I probably would have been a multimillionaire. But instead, I had equity that was worthless. So anyway, just
Let's form a company where you give us advice and we do the opposite.
yeah,
and
exactly.
invest.
Exactly.
Quick question for any of the panelists. I'm just curious if any of you tapped into the Chicago network while you were making your transition.
The question was, did you tap into your Chicago network when you made the transition?
Personally, I tapped into every network that was available to me. And it's remarkable, and I'm sure you've experienced this, everybody knows everybody somehow. It's all about the network. Did this opportunity directly come about as a result of that? No, but others did, which were evaluated in the process.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I've ever moved in my career without it being through the network. Some being through UFC and some being through others, but yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very valuable tool being from such a renowned institution.
I know, Ram, you're tapping your network on an ongoing basis. I mean, the ink's barely dry on your diplomas. I heard about your story from one of your classmates.
Right.
So definitely the case, especially when you're fresh out of school, probably.
I think Jim alluded to this earlier on safety net. I worked at a Fortune 50 company for the past 2.5 years, and we've been through one, level headcount reduction, 4 org changes, and we survived all that. But I don't really see that as a safety net. I need to take my own. How do you guys, in your kind of job, think about safety nets and backup plans?
So the question was from a gentleman at Fortune 250, which in the last 2.5 years has experienced several large restructurings and doesn't really feel it's that safe a job, which echoes something Jim had said earlier. And then the question was turned on our panel, how can you create a safety net? And I guess I'd say related to that, just generally advice for these guys about how to do due diligence when they're doing this, thinking about this kind of switch, if I can add on a little bit to that question. Protect your risk.
Yeah, I guess from a safety net perspective, just, if, and I'm speculating here, but if you kind of see the writing on the wall, even if you're very good at what you do, and you go through a number of rounds of riffs, eventually probably your number is going to get pulled. Or there's a higher and higher likelihood tomorrow that it'll get pulled versus yesterday just because it's a smaller pool. And if you don't kind of either agree or kind of like with the overall direction of where the company is, and that's kind of one of the issues you have when you have either a stagnant or a declining company. The old adage that if you're not growing, you're dying. And that's a perfect example of it, in that if you don't really believe in the company's long-term prospects and kind of where you fit into it, I just think it's incumbent upon you to kind of take it upon yourself to kind of figure out where you kind of want to focus on, big or small, industry, geographic location, if that's important to you, and really kind of start to work the network, because I don't think anything happens very quickly. In any case, when you kind of make that decision of, you're going to start looking, I wouldn't necessarily expect to necessarily have anything kind of fall on your lap within the next 30 or 60 days. I think it's a long, drawn-out process, but I think the first internal look is whether or not you're happy with where you're at, whether or not you're happy, or whether or not you're optimistic on your company's long-term prospects, and then if you're not, I would say that it's probably a time to at least start to put the feelers out there, just if nothing else, from an insurance policy in case if your number does come up.
Yeah, I'd say, we're talking about large companies and whether or not there's a safety net there. I think if you've been there 2-3 years, there's definitely no safety net. You're on target to be in that riff pool, like if that has to happen. I mean, unless you're a really rock star performer. It just, there's so many HR policies and things that protect people who've been there for a little while, that if you've, the safety, if there's a safety net, it's there if you've been there 10, 15 years and beyond, in that your number is going to come up eventually, but you're probably lower on the list.
Yeah, or it might. But
Yeah.
to your point, I mean, you could even be the best person in your group, because I've been involved with those discussions. When you start going through, I mean, there's a number of factors that are considered, and I'm sure there's people that are far more knowledgeable than me on this, but as you're kind of looking at riffs, it's not just about how good of an employee you are. That, I think, is a grossly oversimplified view of it. There's a number of factors, which I think is what
You need the position. There's HR policy.
yeah, there's all the
stuff, and-
HR-related issues that kind of come along with it. So whether it's warranted or not, it may ultimately become. But I'm sorry, I think I interrupted.
No, it's fine. I think it's a good back and forth. I think if the only net that's maybe there is if you've been there 15, 20 years and you've been there a long time. So I wouldn't even pretend like there is one otherwise. And I think you just have to behave like there are no safety nets. So, you're out. Your company number one you represent is yourself in terms of your own career and your own, professional growth. And you just have to make sure that you're
Always assume the worst can happen. You should always be proactively thinking about being on the market. These are two things I hear. Give me some more about, due diligence. What are the things I should be asking? What are the things that could go wrong that I need to be watching for?
When you make the change.
Yeah, or when you're looking for that opportunity, or you got offered that opportunity.
I know the one thing I look at is growth prospects. Get to know the industry, get to know the management team, and do you believe it or don't you? I've always said that if you're a really well-run company, or let me just say you're a well-run company in a bad industry, that's going to be a struggle. As opposed to if you're even an okay-run company in a really good industry, that's a lot easier road, I think, than if you're operating in a very challenging industry. But so I think industry and then management team and just individual company prospects as to whether or not you think that the business plan and the growth strategy they have going forward, whether or not it makes sense to you.
And I guess, and I alluded to this in the remarks at the front of this, there's so many questions. In my case specifically, I was looking to buy a business that was in an industry that I knew absolutely nothing about. So I was being presented with projections and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the day, you need to take a critical assessment of those numbers clearly, realizing that the people that are presenting those to you may not necessarily know what they're doing either, So with all of that, you need to take that with a grain of salt. You need to be well-funded beyond what you had initially expected to make that transition happen. You will, bad things will happen through no fault of your own. In my case specifically, it's taken us, it's kind of like a perennial plant. It's taken us a full 3 years to get from where we were to where we are, and we're just now starting to grow. So there was a lot of this as we moved through the process. And again, I think on the diligence side of things, realize that just be honest with yourself more than anything. And I don't mean to be so naive as to tell you that if you're doing it for the right reasons, it's all going to come up rosy. It's not. In my case specifically, again, I wanted to get out of share-oriented businesses. I hated that zero-sum game. I didn't want to fight for shelf space. I didn't want to fight for 22 share of the white bond market, whatever. I was done with that. I was looking for an opportunity where if I could apply, fantastic skills and talents to a sector of the economy that very few people know about, but if I educated the world about it, all of a sudden it would mushroom on me. I went with that. And unfortunately, the realization of that, the financial realization of that, took 3 years to accomplish. I didn't plan for that, honestly.
So we only have 5 minutes left, so I want to ask each of you gentlemen just a quick question, just for fun, light questions, just to end it with real quick answers. And I'll start with Ram, because you're the one who is the most at the beginning of all of this. So my quick light question for you is, what's the thing that scares the hell out of you about your job?
That I might have to leave San Diego one day.
Seriously?
I'm serious. It's funny. I've moved I don't know, 12 times in the last 15 years, something ridiculous. I've moved a lot. I was here in Chicago for about 6 years, and then we just moved to San Diego, bought a house. My wife loves San Diego. Our kids love it. I've gotten so used to moving that if I actually have to split and leave and pack up and move, that actually, back to your question on personal, the personal part of it actually is what scares me the most. On the professional side, I expect volatility and unpredictable stuff to happen, and I know what's controllable, what I don't control. I'm comfortable with that, and I'm getting the professional growth that I wanted. And probably most of my fears on the personal side, not on the professional side.
That's a great answer. Thanks. Jim, what's it like being owned by Berkshire Hathaway?
Well, for those of you who have read anything about Berkshire Hathaway and how they manage their subsidiaries, so Berkshire Hathaway is 160, 170 billion a year in revenue. There are, 3 lines of business. We've got a very large insurance presence, which probably has about 10 or 12 operating subsidiaries. There are equity investments in other publicly traded companies. That's the second. And then the last, which is where our company falls into it, there are probably 60 or so wholly owned subsidiaries that are outside of insurance. So if you can, and they're in every industry you could possibly imagine. All this is managed out of Berkshire Hathaway, which is based in Omaha, Nebraska. They've got a staff of 24 people that sit at corporate. I would say, and I haven't done the math, but probably a half to 3/4 of them are either accounting, consolidation, SEC reporting related, or treasury, as far as cash comes in from the operating subsidiaries, what are they going to do to actually deploy that cash? So extremely lean. So there is everything you hear about how they operate all their management subsidiaries is 100% true. They put in a management team, and you are responsible for running it yourself. It is almost the exact opposite of your typical private equity portfolio, from the standpoint of there's very little active engagement that kind of happens on a regular basis. They're definitely there if you feel like you need the resources, but essentially it's very much a standalone model that he employs. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but it's just kind of different versus what you have in your typical private equity.
So you're not getting a lot of personal phone calls from Warren Buffett?
No, I personally don't get a lot
Okay.
of calls.
Russ,
from
really quick question, since we're running out of time. Can you tell us something surprising or interesting about some document your company's worked on?
The most interesting one was a few months ago, a woman came to us with she inherited the art collection that her father passed along to her. It was just a bunch of paintings, and she had no idea what it was. She brought them in. There were 15 works. I started going through them, and we got to about the 3rd or the 4th one, and we realized that one of them was pretty important. So I called her up and told her to come back in, and she was then joined by a couple of insurance folks that I invited in, and a couple of folks from, one from Christie's and one from Sotheby's. What she didn't realize is that she inherited some original pen and ink Matisse drawings that her dad decided to build the frames for and affix to the mats using masking tape. So she was told by all of the parties that the opening gavel on the first work was between 1.2 and 1.5 million. She had no idea, 0 idea. She was just floored by that. So, these things do happen.
Okay, when does our next session start? 4:15 is the second set of sessions. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon. And thank you.